Imagine a borough on the edge of one of the world's greatest cities, a place where working families had built something real. Neighborhoods with corner stores, schools, churches, and the kind of dense street life that makes a city feel alive. Now imagine that a single road, less than 7 miles long, managed to accelerate the collapse of much of what those families had built. That is not a metaphor, that is the documented story of the Cross Bronx Expressway. Today, if you drive the Cross Bronx, you move through a corridor of concrete and noise that cuts laterally across the Bronx from the Alexander Hamilton Bridge over the Harlem River toward the Bruckner Interchange in the east, where it connects to Interstate 95 heading toward New England. The road works in the narrow sense that traffic moves, but the neighborhoods on either side of it tell a different story, one of communities that were split, property that lost value, and residents who left and never came back. The contradiction at the heart of this episode is simple. A road built to connect the region ended up disconnecting the borough it ran through. To understand why, you have to go back to what the Bronx actually was before the expressway arrived. The Bronx is the northernmost of New York City's 5 boroughs, covering roughly 42 square miles. In the post-war years, it was a densely populated working-class borough, home to immigrant communities, Jewish and Italian and Irish and Puerto Rican families who had moved up from Manhattan and built stable neighborhood lives. The South Bronx in particular, with neighborhoods like Melrose, Mott Haven, and the Grand Concourse Corridor, was not a slum. It was a functioning urban fabric. The promise of the post-war moment was that infrastructure investment would lift these communities further, that highways would bring economic connection, not rupture. But there was a constraint built into the project from the beginning, one that shaped every decision that followed. The Cross Bronx was designed to move regional traffic, cars and trucks traveling between New Jersey, Manhattan, and New England, through the borough as efficiently as possible. The needs of the people who actually lived in the Bronx were secondary to that regional throughput goal. This was not an accident of poor planning, it was a deliberate hierarchy of priorities, and it meant that when the route was drawn, it was drawn to serve the highway's logic, not the neighborhoods. The first attempt to route the expressway had alternatives. There were paths that would have caused less residential displacement, routes that ran closer to existing rail corridors or through less densely settled areas. Those alternatives were studied and set aside. The chosen alignment cut directly through East Tremont and other established residential neighborhoods, requiring the demolition of apartment buildings and the displacement of thousands of families. Construction began in the early 1950s and continued through the late 1950s and into the 1960s. The physical scar it left was not subtle, a wide, depressed trench of highway running through the middle of the borough, carrying the noise and exhaust of interstate truck traffic through what had been residential streets. The turning point was not a single dramatic moment, it was a cascade. When families were displaced, they moved, often to other parts of the Bronx or out of the borough entirely. The buildings that remained near the expressway became harder to rent and harder to maintain. Landlords in some cases found it more profitable to abandon properties than to keep them up. The highway had also severed the street grid in ways that made walking between neighborhoods harder, reduced foot traffic to local businesses, and created a psychological as well as physical barrier between communities to the north and south of the road. What had been a connected urban fabric became a series of fragments. The mechanism here is worth understanding precisely because it applies far beyond the Bronx. A highway through a dense urban neighborhood does several things simultaneously. It removes housing stock and displaces residents. It introduces noise and air pollution that degrades the livability of adjacent blocks. It cuts pedestrian connectivity, which reduces the economic viability of street-level retail. And it signals to the private market, to landlords, investors, and businesses, that the area is being treated as a transit corridor, rather than a place worth investing in. Each of these effects compounds the others. The result is not just physical damage, it is a reordering of who the neighborhood is for. The The costs were not evenly distributed. The communities most affected by the Cross Bronx were predominantly working class and, over time, increasingly Black and Latino. The South Bronx, which includes neighborhoods bounded or bisected by the expressway and its connecting roads, became one of the most cited examples of urban disinvestment in American history. By the 1970s, the imagery of the South Bronx, abandoned buildings, vacant lots, fires, had become a national symbol of urban failure. That failure had multiple causes, including broader economic shifts, redlining, and policy decisions at every level of government. But the expressway was not incidental to that story, it was structural to it. It is worth pausing on the counterpoint because honest analysis requires it. Some urban historians argue that the Bronx's decline was overdetermined, that deindustrialization, white flight, and federal housing policy would have damaged the borough regardless of the highway's route. There is evidence for that view. It is also true that the Cross Bronx did achieve its stated regional transportation goal. It is a functioning part of Interstate 95, one of the most important freight and passenger corridors on the East Coast. The road connects to Interstate 678, running through Queens toward JFK Airport, and to the network of expressways that make regional movement possible. The question was never whether the highway served regional traffic. It did. The question was what that service cost and who paid it. Today, the Cross Bronx remains. Soundview, a neighborhood whose northern boundary is defined by the expressway itself, is one example of how the highway's presence continues to shape the geography of daily life. The road is not background infrastructure there, it is a literal border. Efforts to address the legacy of the expressway have included proposals to cap sections of it, building a deck over the depressed roadway to create usable land and reduce noise exposure for adjacent residents. Similar approaches have been attempted or proposed in other American cities where urban highways caused comparable damage. These are not cheap solutions, and they do not undo displacement, but they represent a recognition that the original accounting was incomplete, that the costs borne by residents were real costs even when they were not counted. The workable alternative in retrospect was not the absence of regional infrastructure. It was a different method of siting it. Routes that followed existing rail or industrial corridors, or that were designed with community connectivity as a constraint rather than an afterthought, would have served the same regional function with less residential destruction. The lesson is not that highways are inherently destructive, it is that when the costs of infrastructure are externalized onto specific communities, when those communities have less political power to resist, the accounting will always come out wrong. The Cross Bronx did not fail as a road, it failed as an act of planning because it treated a borough full of people as a problem of geometry rather than a place worth protecting. The adjacent question, the one this story opens rather than closes, is whether the cities now proposing to cap or remove urban highways can actually repair what was broken, or whether the displacement was permanent enough that the physical fix arrives too late for the communities that needed it most. Visual reconstructions are illustrative. Facts and interpretations are based on the sources listed in the description.